How would you describe the state of the national economy and Mississippi's economy at this point?
Well, both the national and the state economy are growing very slowly. We are in recovery. It's just a very slow recovery. In fact, the national economic growth rate is expected to be lower this year than it was last, because last year we had a bump up for a while with investment spending and a bit of optimism, which by the end of the year had kind of slowed down. We expect in the state that the growth rate will continue pretty much as it has this past year. We do see a pickup in employment in the private sector, which is very good, but at the same time, our state budget is having some problems, so that we've seen some layoffs in a few public employees. So that overall, the projection is for a very slow growth rate. The unemployment rate this year is expected to be about 10%, about 9% nationally. So it's just a very slow recovery.
Which job sectors in Mississippi have been most affected?
The same sectors that have been most affected nationally. Construction and manufacturing have been hit the hardest. The healthcare sector has managed to continue to grow, and up until this point, the government sector has been doing well, but as I mentioned, we expect that to change some this year.
Well, on that point, is public employment a larger share of the overall employment picture in Mississippi than on the national?
Yeah. In Mississippi, the public sector accounts for 23% of employment, which is quite a bit more than is the case nationally.
How have these economic troubles affected state revenue over the last couple of years, and do you foresee a significant improvement in revenue over the next couple of years?
During the past 2 fiscal years, Mississippi has suffered a drop in revenues. It was greater in FY10 than it was in FY09. This year, we are seeing some very slight improvement. It's basically just a little bit more than 1% higher than last year. So it's not much growth, but at least we are not losing revenue. So we expect this year there will be a slight increase in revenues, but not enough to make up for the slow growth rates of the past couple of years.
And what particular revenue sources have been most affected? Are we looking at income tax, sales tax, or what?
Unfortunately, the hardest hit, it appears, is due to our basic revenue sources like the sales tax and the income tax. The income tax, the drop in revenues from the individual income tax have been a little bit greater than the drop in revenues from the sales tax, but both have been hit fairly hard. Gaming has been hit as well. So overall, we've just seen a drop in most revenue sources.
Now, you mentioned in the latest economic review that federal monies account for 50% of the state's overall revenue. So where does that money go in terms of state agencies and programs?
Okay. Well, we hear more talk about our state general fund budget, but in fact, if you look at the federal monies that we get, half of that total budget comes from the federal government, and a lot of that money will go to health-related programs, for example, particularly Medicaid. We also have a sizable amount of federal funds that are going to the Department of Human Services, to the Department of Employment and Security, to Mississippi Development Authority. There's still some Katrina-related funds that go there. Education, particularly special education, all come from the federal government. We have funds from the federal government going to all those programs and more.
Now, you mentioned things like Medicaid and Human Services, Employment Security. So those are, I imagine a lot of that money is actually going toward things like unemployment benefits and SNAP benefits. Is that correct?
That is correct, that a lot of that is going kind of passed through. The Medicaid goes to basically the persons who are providing medical care. Though that does have a multiplier impact on the rest of the state. So federal funds are very important to Mississippi.
You you talk about performance-based budgeting in this latest review. How might performance-based budgeting by legislators affect state programs and services?
Well, this periodically it's a recurring issue that when it comes time to make budgets, it seems that what happens is that there's a 5%, say, cut in all agencies that can be cut, as opposed to looking at some programs that might be doing very well, perhaps should be expanded, others that aren't doing as well should be shrunk, there should be some combining of functions. There are a lot of suggestions out there. From time to time, different people have made some very sound suggestions, some of which our governor has presented when he presented this year's budget recommendations. But it's that there's not the will to implement the performance-based budgeting when times are fairly good, so that it becomes, when it gets to be a crisis situation, we look at it more seriously. Now there are performance-based measures out there, but they tend to be more in terms of, well, how many people have, for example, received training? But what about the follow-through on that training? How many people who went through the training got a job, and what did those jobs pay? How effective was this particular program? So that the more we can evaluate program and tweak the programs to make them more effective, we'll be getting more bang per buck and doing the taxpayer service.
And finally, you devote some time in the economic review to a discussion of tax reforms. Which reforms do you view as critical for improving the state's revenue outlook?
Well, when it comes to taxation, you have to have in mind what revenues you want and how you're going to be using them. Once you have a goal for the amount of revenues you'd like to raise, then you have to look at your tax base. That's one thing that I find that we don't do so much. We look at, well, here are the current taxes, and we have to build on them. There's a very heavy reliance here on the sales tax, for example, much more so than in other states. We have the highest, well, after California. California has increased its sales tax. We have the second highest now, statewide sales tax at 7%. Now, the average might be up in other areas because they have cities that might have their own individual sales tax, but it's a burden of over $1,000 per capita, and the income tax, on the other hand, is the last figures I saw were a little bit less than $500 per capita, which is a much lower, we have a much lower income tax than other states. We have to look at our taxes in comparison to other states. We can join with there's a multi-state tax commission that is trying to get some reforms in place so all states have the same way of estimating what corporate income is. Because if a corporation says, well, we didn't make our income in Mississippi, we made it in Texas, then our tax base is shrunk. But if they have a level playing field so that they have to report the same numbers to Texas as they reported to Mississippi, then it's more likely that we'll be able to institute a fair share taxing of corporations. So I think it's important that we follow through on the recommendation that we look at joining the Multi-State Tax Commission in terms of what we might improve our corporate tax revenues.
Now, that sort of thing in terms of the corporate tax and talk about raising user fees for certain things.
Yeah, I like the idea of using user fees and using taxes to penalize behavior we don't like. The problem is that the tax base isn't as large. But if you look at, for example, our Department of Environmental Quality, apparently we don't charge as much as other states do for issuing permits to different businesses that need the permit. If we were simply to charge enough to cover the cost of the department's expenses, then that would make a lot of sense.
Do you think that raising those sort of fees and corporate taxes, or reforming the corporate tax, for instance, do you think those sort of things might play into the perception of Mississippi as a less business-friendly environment? Because
Well, I think it's the business-like thing to do. I mean, if we're going to be talking about taxation, we should be assessing, what is the situation here? Where would we get revenues equitably and in a stable sense? And from the studies I've seen about what corporations are looking for, more so than looking at taxes, they look at what the state has to offer in terms of location, in terms of workforce, and simply in terms of responsiveness. And I think Mississippi is really right at the top when it comes to responsiveness. I've been in other locations where a business really needs to get something taken care of by the local government, and it just doesn't happen. And that discourages the business from locating there. They'll get a bad report. Now, here we're in the situation where we're very responsive to the needs of businesses who are trying to increase their production and hire more people.
Mm-hmm. And,
so that's a very business-friendly environment.
And of course, in terms of business-friendly, there's always, there tend to be a lot of tax incentives to companies to actually move their operations here. Are we still getting the better end of the deal in terms of removing those tax or offering the incentives to companies?
It's important that Mississippi stay competitive with other states in terms of the tax incentives that we offer, but we also have to make certain that we get back what we are expecting from the corporations. And if, for example, the wages that aren't being paid aren't what we thought they were, or the business is not doing as well and is unable to offer as many jobs as it had planned on doing, then we have to look at scaling back the incentives. Other states are taxing the breaks or the incentives that they provided to the business. So that there are different ways of monitoring these incentives and ensuring that we are indeed making the best use of funds. And I think it's also very important to balance how much we are providing tax subsidies to corporations who are not in Mississippi versus businesses that are here. In the long run, Mississippi's growth is going to depend on the vitality of its local businesses. It's our ability to innovate. We're very low, for example, in terms of the number of patents granted per capita. We need to do more to encourage innovation. We have some really exciting new companies out there developing new technologies and some real opportunities for venture capital. And I think it's important that we look at fostering that kind of business.
Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of what we should watch here in Mississippi on the state of the economy, and what we should watch for in terms of the overall impact of budget cuts this year and the coming years, and in terms of the services that we provide as a state?
In the long term, and this has been said for many years now, the cost of health care has just been rising so rapidly that it's eating into the federal budget, it's eating into state budgets. It's one of the major expenses associated with retirees, and as you have more and more persons retiring, the expenditures for health care are going to be increasing. The Government Accountability Office is projecting for most states a huge increase in health-related expenditures, which is going to be causing a fiscal squeeze even after the end of this recession. So I think it's important that we look at what's happening, the different options out there to get healthcare costs under control. And there are a lot of interesting initiatives in the healthcare reform bill that really have to be looked at, and in some cases I would like to see some of those initiatives that are right now pilot programs expanded. So that's one area. In terms of what's happening over the coming years in the state, well, I'm also concerned about the financial sector. There, in Europe, as we know, there's a lot of concern about the huge government deficits and the debt. They are instituting austerity programs, which means that Europe might not be able to pull out of the recession as rapidly as it should, which is again going to impact us in this country. It's going to slow down our exports. We also have to be concerned about the huge United States debt, and we have to pay it down. So that another factor that's going to be impacting Mississippi is at some point the federal government is probably not going to give us as much subsidies as we have had in the past. So that means that we really have to have some plans in place for, well, what are we going to do when we lose even more federal funds than we're losing now with the stimulus money. We have to, again, the performance-based budgeting, keep an eye on that. There's a lot of people who are out there talking about, implementing some changes there, but let's see to what extent it happens. We, as concerned citizens, we should really talk with our legislators about what's happening with the performance-based budgeting.